complete grasp on what's, let's say, Wittgenstein's conception of ethics. But let me say that I brought in empathy in the context of Schopenhauer. So that, I mean, usually Schopenhauer's conception of ethics is based on this kind of, let's say, identification with suffering, which is not just your own. That is, it's not the egoistic perspective, but it's a way of being. I would say it's his way of thinking of what it is to partake in world will. Now, Wittgenstein, again, there's a big difference, I think, between the discussion of the notebooks and the way in which Wittgenstein trims it, I would say, in the Tractatus. But he definitely doesn't want empathy precisely because it raises various questions about, how you identify with others and what is exactly uh, uh, empathy. Does it require concepts? Is it a matter of just feeling and so on? Um, the whole preparation I did comparing uh, Schopenhauer and Wittgenstein was in some way to do away with this conception of empathy, which requires us to go through the sphere of representation of concepts and so on. So that really, and this needs to be spelled out. I know. I would say, you know, the good person is the person that has a significant world. It is uh, maybe something that can be clarified if we ask in what way does the bad person not someone who has a significant world? And think of someone who does some bad deed, right? So we have what we call remorse, which is one kind of response, and we have the pangs of conscience. And to be, as it were, uh, haunted by your conscience is a way for the person to be all the time fixed on this particular event, right? The particular thing he did. In that sense, that person doesn't live in a significant world. That person is all the time bound to a particular event, right? It is as though he cannot reach that kind of standpoint, which is the standpoint which Wittgenstein would call happiness, i.e., agreement with the world. So I would say, the problem is how do we have a conception of happiness which is not the satisfaction of the particular will by this or that, because particularity cannot be what makes the difference. Happiness must be agreement with the world. It's not pleasure in any straightforward sense. What it is to act in such a way that you think of your will as being in agreement with true reality. Uh, Again, this is an ethics that is very different from various models we have, right? Of course, from utilitarian models, of course, from Kantian deontological models with the emphasis on the law and the categorical imperative. Also, I would like to say to various models of empathy, or sympathy, a la Hume or Schopenhauer. It's one thing that is, I think, difficult in such a conception of ethics is that you don't think here quite in terms of uh, bipolarity, right? This character, which we found, is paradigmatic for what facts or propositions are, right? The bipolar aspect of sense is not quite what we have in ethics. It's agreement with the world, not with any specific content that can be negated, or not having, in some sense, a world, being at the mercy of events, um, which is, so to speak, the bad. Um, I think, much can be said for an ethics of what I call significance. But of course, you start asking, okay, isn't that something, much more like an aesthetic standpoint on the world, right? You experience the world as significant. What about the relation to others? What is, specific place that another person has in this kind of ethics? Isn't it, after all, too solipsistic? All this, I think, must be taken into consideration when we try to develop this kind of ethical dimension of being in meaning, uh, as such. I think it is something that, you can speak of as developing in Wittgenstein's later conception, to the extent that you never have a discussion of any topics that has to do with ethics in the investigation, yet you feel that it's all uh, permeated by some kind of ethical attitude, which puts as its you know the most significant problem is the way in which you drown in nonsense, in emptiness, and the opposite is having a significant world. That is the polarity, the strange polarity, which is different from the yes no of the proposition, or good and evil on assumption that these are two contentful yet opposite possibilities. It's and this is all to be developed, I think. But your question is right to the point here.
So now, sorry, Professor Sarkar, you would like to ask?
Uh, yes, please. I'd like to thank Professor Friedlander for his wonderful lecture. I was glued to it right from the beginning, but I have some queries, some uneasiness regarding this comparison. Like it's true that like you focused more on this notebook where he talked about world spirit and the psychophysical parallelism. Uh, and yes, that is, had he kept this paragraph in the Tractatus, it would have been much easier for us to compare Wittgenstein with Schopenhauer. But the problem which I feel is that Wittgenstein in the last line is saying that the consideration of willing makes it look as if one part of the world were closer to me than another, then in bracket, which would be intolerable. That is, my body does not occupy any privileged status or does not stand on a higher level than other bodies or other objects in the world. So this is one difference, and I'd like to know how you would conjecture on the reasons why Wittgenstein dropped this important thing in the Tractatus. And the second query is Wittgenstein very clearly, candidly denies the representing subject. Like there is no such thing as thinking or representing self. So the person who just does not admit the existence of a representing subject, how do we compare him to someone who is this? The world is a representation. And another thing, it seems that Wittgenstein never adopted the skeptical principles necessary for solipsism. Like it seems maybe it'll be too crude to say it one line that his solipsism was more like kind of uh, more kind of linguistic solipsism than epistemological solipsism, which it seems that Schopenhauer endorsed. And I'm also eager to know about your explanation of the most important point in the discussion of solipsism, that solipsism coincides with uh, pure realism, which Schopenhauer did not have this compulsion to explain it in this way. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, these are important questions. I think they are in some way related, or at least my attempt to answer your questions will relate them. So let me start with the question on the notebooks and the very important passage that you quoted uh, about whether one can try to will something and uh, the following remark: for the consideration of willing makes it look as if one part of the world were closer to me than another, which would be intolerable. Now, what is Wittgenstein aiming at here? Um, we could imagine that there's a division in the world between what can be willed, that is, all the parts of the world which I can latch on with my will, and another part of the world which is outside the scope of my willing. You know, I can try to will uh, a chair in front of me to be in another place without doing anything with my body and find out, well, that doesn't work. So this is not quite possible for my will. And Wittgenstein says, no, there's something very wrong in thinking of it that way. Uh, and part of what is wrong with it is that it divides the world, right? It makes it look as if one part of the world is closer to me than another. And if one part of the world is closer to me than another, then I can place the subject at that position where, is encircled by the closer things, right? The subject then would not be the limit of the world, it would be in the world. And this is what he doesn't want. This is what is intolerable. We must have an interpretation of willing which would make this partition of the world into things that are closer to me than others nonsensical, incoherent. Now, this is a difficult analysis, and I would refer, I treated those passages in a paper I mentioned of mine, Logic, Ethics, and Existence in the Tractatus, where there's a very long discussion of, how exactly do you fit the conception of the will a la Schopenhauer, the world as will, with something which we would call, our ordinary way of speaking of the will that is involved in our acting and in our doing things and so on. And so there's a story to be told, and there's a lot that Wittgenstein devotes in the notebooks to thinking how those two things can come together. But here, I think it goes precisely with my interpretation that somehow uh, the Schopenhauerian conception of the will is something that expresses itself in the world, not in parts of the world which I can reach with my will. This is the particular will, and so he says, if we think metaphysically, there can't be a part of the world that is closer to me than others. With respect to the representing subject, why is it that uh, Wittgenstein doesn't have something like the world is my representation in Schopenhauer? I would say the following. Um, can Schopenhauer justify the my in the world is my representation without implicitly appealing to the dimension of will? In a sense, what he tells us is that representation has no my. It is this I that is completely neutral. So I would argue, and this is a claim about Schopenhauer, that ultimately to make sense of the world is my representation, we need the in some way to move to the dimension of will there that underlies that claim. And with Wittgenstein as well, as long as you in some way uh, discuss picturing and the relation of pictures and facts and making sense and all that, it's completely neutral. The subject doesn't come in. You do not have my picture or my representation. This is very important. The subject comes in at a specific point, precisely as not this is my representation, uh, this is my body, and so on. This is my world, this is my language. And the big question is, what does it mean to say this is my world? Right? Is it just a figure of speech, or really Wittgenstein gives us here an indication that a new uh, dimension is opened up, one in which we have to think together: world, limit, uh, ipseity, my own, and so on. And of course, this is the place where solipsism becomes an issue, because the solipsist is a model for thinking of this way of tying my and world. And for the solipsist, all there is himself and the world that opens up from, as it were, this center. But Wittgenstein is not saying solipsism is true. He's saying, let us think the truth of solipsism. This is, I think, one of the places where you see is philosophical sensibility. Even when he dismisses some view as nonsense in some way, he says, this is the human spirit that expresses itself. There must be something in it. Not quite what the person thinks there is in it, but let me show you what is the truth of solipsism. And he says, ultimately, if you think of the truth of solipsism, it leads you to realism, as you pointed out. It leads you to pure realism, he wants to say, to some sense in which, again, you don't distinguish between yourself and other things. In the notebooks, he says, my body is at the same level as stones and beasts and so on. Which is to say, again, it is the world that is the expression of the will. There's nothing you can here identify with me as a being in the world. Okay, so I think these all fit together with this translation of a Schopenhauerian insight, I would say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bharatman, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. Yes, please. So I hope you can hear me.